Shemai guys, welcome back to the Life to the Full podcast, the podcast that helps you make the most of your time here on Earth. My name's Dav Morse, I'm your host, and it is a pleasure to be back on the airwaves once again. Today we return to our final episode in the series of 7 tips that you should definitely ignore. Last week we had an emergency set your financial goals for the year episode. Timely, beginning of the new year. But we're back finishing off the series. We've looked at 7 financial tips you should ignore, 7 physical health tips you should ignore, mental health tips, relational health tips, and now we are finally finishing with 7 spiritual health tips that you should definitely need to ignore. I've gotten quite a few new listeners over the past couple of months, especially exciting to see people listening on Christmas Day. That was nice. And this episode, like I said, comes at the end of the series. So if you haven't listened to the other ones, why don't you go back, listen to some of the others. And if you are new here, maybe you want to go and pick something that you like the look of, like the sound of in the archives, and then come back to this one when you've got a little bit more of a vibe of what the podcast's all about. Alternatively, if you're here now, so you're probably going to be listening. Why don't you, before deciding whether or not this podcast is for you, go back and listen to a couple of the other episodes to see what you think before you judge, because this one could be an interesting one. The spiritual health episodes tend to not have as many downloads as the financial health and physical health episodes, and especially the ones about quitting your job or making goals. But these are the most important ones. So here we go. Let's kick off today's episode. 7 tips, spiritual health tips you should definitely ignore. Number 1, good vibes only. This is so popular. It's even made it onto the t-shirts for kids, posters. You see it everywhere. I used to personify this advice myself. For decades, I'd share good vibes only, always bringing the energy and positivity to a situation. I wouldn't entertain any negative vibes myself, and I didn't want my positive demeanour to be spoilt by anyone bringing bad vibes. I was always the first one to point out the bright side to any situation. I always had an answer for people's problems. Oh, you've hurt your knee and you can't run. Well, at least you can still walk. Oh, your cat died. Well, at least your kids are okay. Oh, there's no bacon left. Well, at least there's cheese in the cupboard. Oh, our surprise romantic trip to Paris has been cancelled because you didn't have an up-to-date passport. Don't worry, we get to pick a movie from Blockbuster that we haven't seen before. Yes, that did actually happen to me. It didn't matter what problems people had, I would always immediately point out the positives. Or at least, it's not as bad as... whatever. And my natural disposition is still this. But I'm in the process of learning to let people sit with their feelings and acknowledge their feelings first. My wife is a very patient woman to stick with me for 19 years. I'm a slow learner when it comes to this. She's teaching me the importance of feeling negative emotions as well as the positive. When we allow someone to share their feelings, even if they aren't good vibes, and not dismiss them out of hand, as I have done for many, many years, we can connect with them in a way that is deeper than just giving them the positive spin on things. I don't believe it's helpful to wallow in the negative emotions, and it's all too easy to let negative emotions take hold, which can lead to a downward spiral. I believe in using these negative emotions to build something positive. But we do need to recognize and feel them. Another reason to reject the good vibes only motto is that it makes us more honest. I'm positive person, excited about life about 99% of the time. I'm like Angela Duckworth, but not as smart. But for that 1% of the time, I don't want to be pretending. Usually the thing that hampers my good vibes only is when I'm unable to meet my wife's emotional needs, and that upsets me. It doesn't benefit anyone for me to pretend otherwise. Honesty is the foundation for any relationship, so practice honesty at all costs. Then use that pain and hurt to do better next time. And even if I don't do better next time, as I often don't, I can give myself grace to try again next time. So my evolved take is good vibes mostly, but I want to validate your feelings too. Not quite as catchy as good vibes only, probably wouldn't make it onto a t-shirt, but nevertheless a better take on things. Tip number 2. Spiritual health tip number 2 that you should definitely ignore is, if science can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. If science can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. I was talking with a young lad the other day, and I gave him a preview of this episode, and he misunderstood this tip that is awful and you should definitely ignore. He said, "Don't you believe in science?" The first thing to say is, I love science, I believe in science. This young lad had missed the point slightly. Just because I believe in things that science can't prove, it doesn't mean I disbelieve things that science has proved. I understand the rationale and logic behind the statement, if science can't prove it, then it doesn't exist. When people make claims about things that help you lose weight or things that will improve your mental health, you want there to be evidence to back up the claims. It means in some way that you can play it safe and only do things which are proven to work. The problem is that some things work or exist that either aren't yet provable with science or won't ever be provable by science. Just as a quick example, gravitational waves. Those ripples in space-time, an absolutely phenomenal topic to get into, by the way, were first proposed by Einstein back in 1916 when he was working on his famous theory of relativity. For decades, it was just a mind-blowing idea until 1974 when scientists spotted indirect evidence through the orbital decay of the Hulse-Taylor binary pulsar consistent with energy loss due to gravitational waves. Fast forward to 2015 and boom, LIGO detected these waves directly from two black holes colliding. It was like Einstein's century-old theory coming to life. Amazing, right? Science took 100 years to prove something that was proposed as a theory and has in fact been the case since the beginning of time. I don't think science will ever prove the existence of God, but following our argument, there's no reason to believe that God doesn't exist. The philosophical burden of proof is a popular philosophy which puts the burden of proof on the person making the proposal. But even if Einstein couldn't prove the existence of gravitational waves, it doesn't mean that it wasn't true. It just simply took 100 years to catch up. Are we 100 years from proving God's existence? Who knows? But we certainly can't categorically say that God doesn't exist. Spiritual health tip number 3 that you should definitely ignore is, you need to let your children figure out religion on their own. You have to let them find their own path. This is shockingly bad advice. Again, the young lad I was sharing this with the other day was surprised that I didn't think that this was a good idea. I assume he's been brought up in a post-truth paradigm where we can just figure out what's true as we go along. We mustn't force our religion on anyone, including our children. This is why I think this is dumb. Some things kids work out for themselves. They learn to talk with only mild correction for the most part. They learn how far they can push their bodies by falling over or skidding on their bikes. But some things that just can't be absorbed if you want to do them properly. Take mathematics, for example. It would be completely foolish not to teach your kid about numbers and algebra and calculus and just expect them to figure it out on their own. They need guidance, instruction, and correction. They need someone to tell them what's right. Now you might be thinking, Dav, religion isn't like mathematics. It's not something that's provable. You've just said that in point 2. You're right. But the point is, if you want your children to learn something that doesn't come naturally, like religion, if it's something you value and want your children to value as well, you have to teach them and instruct them. If you value honesty, for example, you need to teach your children not to lie. Children will automatically choose to lie as soon as they develop enough understanding to realize you don't know everything they know, and vice versa. Children need to be taught that lying is not the way to conduct themselves. If you don't teach your children your values, then society will dictate their values. I don't want to run the risk of letting society decide what's right and wrong for my kids. I don't think the collective is right about a lot of things. Therefore, I'm going to instruct and teach my children in the way that they should go, so that when they are older, they won't depart from it. Letting your children figure out religion on their own is like letting them on Love Island and saying, "There you go, son, go find out about relationships." The world will likely not reflect your personal values, particularly if you have religious values. So don't let the world teach your kids what to value. Do it yourself. Spiritual health tip number 4 that you should definitely ignore is, it's my truth, and you can have your truth. I was struck recently by how prevalent this is, particularly among Gen Z. I've spoken to so many people who seem completely dismissive of absolute truth, and don't even seem to care about the importance of whether or not there is absolute truth or not. I understand how some things are up for debate. Let's just take diet and nutrition as an example. There are people who would die on the vegan hill and say, this is the absolute only way to eat. Sorry, vegans, I'm not picking on you. There are carnivores, paleo folk, and all sorts that are equally as dogmatic. But there are also vegans and carnivores and paleos that will say, this is my truth, but you can have your truth. And to some extent, this is true. In fact, our bodies are such intricate works of art that these different foods will affect us in different ways. I might tolerate gluten better than someone else. Someone else's body might only tolerate meat. So in that sense, you can have my truth and your truth. But then there is objective truth as well. Some things are always true throughout time and space. Like eating this massive plateful of death cap mushrooms will kill you, whatever diet you're following. If you're a vegan, or a carnivore, or a paleo, or whatever, there is no longer my truth and your truth when it comes to what happens when you eat a massive plateful of death caps. There is just truth. Objective truth that you're going to die. Similarly, there's no your truth and my truth when it comes to our natural ability to fly. I can't fly, and you can't fly, and believing that you can fly doesn't make it true. I once asked a different young lad, whether he would try and stop someone believing they could fly if they were about to jump off a cliff. He said, that's their truth, so he wouldn't try and stop them. Aside from the ethical dilemma here, at least this young lad was willing to follow his conviction through to its conclusion. I believe I have my truth and they have their truth. Then I have to let them jump. Aside from the ethical dilemma, it doesn't make the jumper's truth actually true. Just believing something doesn't make it true. We can have different opinions on things, but there is such a thing as objective truth. Not everything is relative. I'm kind of enjoying this so far, so we're about to go into tip number 5. Tip number 5, spiritual health tip that you should definitely ignore, is I'm just taking a bit from this religion and a bit from that religion and kind of making my own take on it all. I understand the appeal of wanting to take what's good from one religion and what's good from another and putting them together and making a kind of holistic, all-encompassing religion which suits your own beliefs and life's philosophies. One of the main problems I see with this solution is it basically makes you God and makes you the highest form of morality. I personally wouldn't want that level of responsibility, and it will certainly prove difficult to put into practice. I'll get to a C.S. Lewis quote later. What the heck, I'll put it in here as well. Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing that it cannot be is moderately important. As far as I'm aware, Jesus is the only person to claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. We are conditioned by our culture to think of religion as a personal preference. We are told, you've got yours, I've got mine, there's no right one. But as we've just seen, some things are subjective and others are objectively true. If Jesus' claim is incorrect, then by all means take what you want and leave what you don't. But if Jesus' claim is true, then it closes the door to all other options. Spiritual health tip number 6 that you should definitely ignore is do whatever you like. There's nothing at the end when you die anyway. If you've ever given it any thought at all, and understandably a lot of folk in the West may not have given it much thought, because it's a bit scary, a bit taboo. It's not something that's pleasant to consider. If you've given it any thought, what happens when you die, then there are 2 camps that you can fall in. There's the when you die there's nothing camp, and there's the when you die there's something else camp. As much as I'm a man of faith, I'm also a man of mathematics. Many years ago, I came across Pascal's wager. For anyone unfamiliar, 17th century mathematician Blaise Pascal of Pascal's triangle fame, which is something I often use when I'm doing binomial expansion, came up with this matrix of ideas to rationalize belief in God. It's not trying to prove that God exists, merely showing that from a rational point of view, it's a great bet. Essentially, the matrix looks like this. Picture this in your head, a 4x4 matrix. Across the top, we have God exists and God does not exist. At the side, we have believe in God and don't believe in God. So our 4 items are believe in God and He exists. That leads to eternal happiness, enjoyment and contentment. Believe in God and He doesn't exist, in which case it doesn't matter. Don't believe in God and He doesn't exist, in which case it also doesn't matter. And the last case is don't believe in God and He does exist, which is the case we end up with eternal misery and pain. In both cases, if God doesn't exist, then it doesn't matter. whether you believe it or not. You've lost nothing, gained nothing. But if God does exist, then believing him is the optimal choice. I found that a considerable persuasive argument as a logical young lad, and it was another tick in my journey of faith. I've since discovered that there are many arguments against Pascal's wager, including you haven't really lost nothing if you've spent your life serving a God who doesn't exist. You've led a miserable life, a miserable existence, following arbitrary rules when you could have been having fun, enjoying yourself. This is an argument that is only presented by those who don't have any experience of a relationship with God. I've spoken to countless older folk who have gotten close to the end of their time on earth, and if they are still walking with God, invariably they say how amazing it's been to follow him. Other arguments against Pascal's wager are, well, even if I do realize it's a better wager to believe in God, how can I just do that if I just don't believe in him? Well, maybe you can't just conjure up belief, but you can take steps to explore whether you think it's reasonable or not for God to exist, and how you could get to know him. C.S. Lewis of the Chronicles of Narnia fame said, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. If it's of utmost importance, then it's worth exploring." Another argument against Pascal's wager is, by that logic, I should always wear a garlic necklace, just in case Dracula exists. The problem with this is that no credible person would claim that Dracula exists, whereas millions of people across the world, and across the centuries, billions, many of whom are far smarter and more well-respected than you or I, do claim that God exists. It's not a completely ridiculous notion. And one final point, if you're still not sure. Assuming you're not a committed atheist who has done your own research, considered the argument, and arrived at your own conclusion that God doesn't exist, then we should consider carefully the possibility that God does exist. Let me paint you a picture of a fictitious land called Flatland. Flatland is a two-dimensional land. All its inhabitants are 2D shapes. The more sides you have, the higher up the social pecking order you are. Triangles and squares are at the bottom of the social order, and circles at the very top, with an infinite number of sides. Our heroine of our story is a young girl called Hex. She's a hexagon, and one day she is visited from above by a creature from the third dimension, a sphere. If you can imagine a flat 2D plane with a sphere above it, as the sphere comes down and enters the 2D plane, it starts as a dot, as a point, and it passes through. The point becomes a circle, which is getting bigger, and then gets smaller again as it passes through to the other side, and then disappears. So Hex sees this expanding circle and is then taken out of Flatland by the sphere into the third dimension and goes to visit two other lands. First, she's taken to Pointland, which has no dimensions. All the point knows is itself. It doesn't know left or right or up nor down, just itself, the point. Then the sphere takes Hex to Lineland. The king of Lineland can travel along the line only in one dimension, left and right. The king of Lineland only knows what left and right is. He knows what's to the left of him and what's to the right of him. There's no second dimension for him to travel. Hex is able to move in and out of Lineland, appearing as if by magic. To the king of Lineland, she seems to appear and disappear inexplicably. He's got no concept of a second dimension in which another creature could exist. As Hex goes back to Flatland, although she cannot see the third dimension anymore, she's convinced of its existence and goes about trying to convince others of the third dimension. I consider it perfectly reasonable to expect that there is another dimension beyond what our three-dimensional brains can experience or imagine. In the story, the sphere, despite being the creature of the higher dimension in Flatland, is visited in his third dimension by a hypercube, which is a fourth-dimensional cube. The cube appears in 3 dimensions and appears to be changing shape, but all it's doing is rotating in the 4th dimension. So despite being visited from the 4th dimension, the sphere refuses to believe in any dimensions more than 3. To me, the possibility of something existing in a higher dimension which can visit our 3-dimensional world is not only non-trivial, but extremely probable. I'll leave that with you for now. So do send me a message on Instagram if you've got any questions or thoughts. Finally, last spiritual health tip that you should definitely ignore is I'm manifesting it. Let's be honest, manifestation is everywhere. You hear it all the time. Just visualize it, believe it, and the universe will deliver. But here's the problem. It's terrible advice, and here's why. First of all, the universe is not at your beck and call. There is nothing you can do to manifest just by visualizing it. Why is manifestation even in the conversation these days then? There must be something that draws people in and some element of it working in some way. Firstly, if you are constantly feeding your brain with images of the things that you want, then naturally you are going to notice opportunities to do these things that you wouldn't have noticed if it wasn't for the fact that you'd been thinking about them this morning. Since quitting my job, I have noticed so many different opportunities simply because I'd opened my mind up to seeing them. When I was a teacher, I didn't have the time, or more importantly, the headspace to think about attracting different opportunities into my life. And now I see opportunities everywhere. In fact, probably in too many places. There is scientific research into the practice of visualization. There's research been done into basketball players who can improve their free throw percentage by visualizing the ball going in the goal. But the most powerful visualizing techniques are best paired with physically doing the thing. Manifestation doesn't do anything without action. If you ask people who really believe in manifestation, they invariably say that they were working towards something and then all of a sudden the thing they were working towards manifested. It appeared. It's because they were putting themselves out there. Luck is where preparation meets opportunity, as a wise man once said. Interestingly, as I was considering this point, as a man of faith, I need to contend with passages on faith in the Bible. Passages like Mark 11:22-25. And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly, I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours." It does sound similar to manifesting. Here's the difference. It confuses faith with fantasy. Faith is about trusting God's promises and aligning your life with His will. Manifesting is about twisting your will into existence. Two entirely different things. Faith moves us towards God. Manifesting pulls us deeper into ourselves. Whew! I got a bit carried away there. I actually kind of enjoyed that. Let me know if you enjoyed that episode as well. And if you didn't, why don't you go back and listen to some of the other ones that take your fancy from the archives. And like I said, I'm now on Instagram Threads, so if you do have the app, head on over to Life to the Full podcast and say hi. Thank you very much for your attention once again. Thank you to the new listeners, my listeners from Germany. Guten Tag to you. And I will see you sometime soon. Till next time, peace out.